Welcome to MBAV 6601, which is the course called International Business. This is the PowerPoint lecture for Chapter 6. In this presentation, I want to cover material in the book from Chapter 6 and also some material that comes from the news media. I am Dr. Bruton, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. As we go through this material, you can email me if you have any questions. My email address is on the screen. However, to get a quicker answer, I encourage you to ask your tutor. If you are now studying Unit 3, I would suggest that you finish the Unit 2 essay if you have not already done so. My expectations for you in this course are: number 1, read the course syllabus. Number 2, read the textbook. Number 3, if you have questions, you can ask your tutor. Number 4, review the video presentation for each chapter covered in the course. I want you to know that there are no shortcuts. Do the work, learn the material. It will help you in your career. The next assignment is at the end of Unit 4. In reality, it has parts that come from both Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The first part is a simple case study that presents the concepts of absolute and comparative advantage. You will need to demonstrate that you understand that concept. The second part is to analyze the case study in Chapter 7 called the U.S.-Vietnamese catfish dispute, and answer the 2 questions at the end. In each presentation, I try to find actual news events from your country that pertain to our topic. After that, I will cover the critical issues of the chapter. Because we have a lot to cover, the length of this presentation will be about 26 minutes from start to finish. Let's start with the headline. Vietnam 2019 trade surplus $11.12 billion, beating $9.94 billion forecast. Actually, exports in 2019 rose a little over 8%. while imports only rose about 7%. In other words, exports are growing faster than imports. That's good. That means your country is bringing in more money than they are spending. The small print in the article says that the country had a $46 billion surplus from the U.S. Now, our president thinks that any country that it trades with should not have a surplus or a deficit. So that would imply that Vietnam should import more goods and services from the United States to offset that surplus. Another small item in the article is that Vietnam had a $34 billion trade deficit with China. The Chinese should buy more Vietnamese goods to offset that deficit. Economists are always trying to figure out why countries trade and how to make it better. In this chapter, we'll cover 9 trade theories that will help explain the rationale behind international trading. We won't cover the theories in the order that they're listed here, but we will cover them. The modern form of trading had its roots back in the age of exploration. The European nations developed new technology in the form of wind navigation and navigating by compass. This age of exploration led to finding new countries, colonizing them, and exporting their resources. This became the age of mercantilism. Mercantilism is a term you need to know and understand. from the 1500s to the 1800s, the colonial powers like the Dutch, the Spanish, the English, the French, and the Portuguese would sail to the New World, capture it, and exploit the resources. They did this to North America, South America, Africa, and Asia. It's part of your history, and it's part of my history. While these traders were interested in slaves, they were also interested in agricultural products like tobacco, coffee, and spices, and rubber. They were particularly interested in precious metals like gold and silver. Most of these colonial powers were governed by a monarchy. They usually had a king or a queen calling the shots. These monarchies had navies and armies that they had to pay and finance. Their own population was not rich enough to pay enough taxes to maintain these navies and armies, so they had to bleed their colonies for the money. This is how trading in the modern age got started. The more technological dominant countries exploited the weaker countries. The trend for independence started in the 1700s and continued through the 1900s. Let's talk about neo-mercantilism. It advocates that a nation should export more than it imports, like Vietnam is doing now. Thus, it should generate a trade surplus. That trade surplus makes a country richer and thus able to afford bigger armies and navies. Does this sound familiar? Which country has the largest trade surplus in the world? I'll give you a hint. It's a country that's on your border. And what are they spending their money on? I'll give you another hint. Armies and navies. Economists want to be able to predict why countries trade, what they trade, and why. The purpose is to get countries to work together and create an efficient allocation of resources. Here are two theories of how countries trade. First, the gravity model. The name comes from its utilizing the gravitational force concept as an analogy to explain the volume of bilateral trade flows. The top U.S. trading partner is China, and the top China trading partner is the U.S. Why do the United States and China trade more heavily with each other than other countries? The United States and China have the two largest economies in the world. Why does the gravity model work? There are several reasons. Number one, larger countries trade more than smaller countries. Number two, they also tend to attract large shares of other countries' spending because they produce a wide range of products. Number three, because of the volume, trading costs are lower. The bottom line is because of their size, they can meet each other's needs. Next, the country similarity model is an example would be the United States' second and third largest trading partners are Canada and Mexico in that order. The hypothesis is that companies create products for their own domestic markets. Their own domestic markets are not that different from markets in similar countries. Similarity usually refers to cultural similarity, political and legal similarity, economic similarity, and sometimes geographical closeness. If countries are close by, they speak the same language, practice the same religion, and you can make a case for similarity. Both Canada and Mexico meet these conditions. They are close by, both have similarities found in the United States. China's number 2 and 3 trading partners are South Korea and Japan. You could make an argument that South Korea and Japan are more culturally similar and geographically closer to China, which is why they are the numbers 2 and 3 trading partners. I would not be surprised to see Vietnam enter that club in the next 10 to 15 years. The next theory is one of having absolute or natural advantage. Absolute advantage holds that some countries produce goods and products more efficiently than others. Absolute advantage means that your country has the lowest price or a monopoly on a resource. For example, China has an absolute advantage on many rare earth minerals. Their presence in the Earth's crust seems to be plentiful in China, and while refining them is a dirty process, China has made the decision to be the world's largest producer of these rare earth minerals. Natural advantage means that your country has inherited advantages like climate, natural resources, and human resources. For example, Vietnam has many natural resources such as a warm climate, many rivers, a long coastline, and a sizable and motivated workforce. The way to prove this theory is to look at what a country imports and exports. For example, since Costa Rica in Central America has a nice warm climate, some of their main exports are bananas, pineapples, dates, and avocados. One of Iceland's top exports is fish and fish byproducts. In both cases, these countries take advantage of their natural resources. Having said that, we are in an age where agricultural products and natural resource commodities have taken a back seat to manufactured products. According to the 2018 CIA World Factbook, the value of the world's agricultural output is $5 trillion. There are only 9 countries where agriculture is the dominant source of their GDP. In comparison, the manufacturing and industry sector accounts for $24 trillion worldwide. Let me mention also about acquired advantage. This usually results either in product or process technology. Anytime you have invented something that creates a new product or saves time making an old product, you have acquired an advantage. Product and process technology are described in the textbook. Production technology is the machinery that makes creating a tangible physical product possible for a business. This is usually the result of strong research and development effort and a highly educated and motivated workforce. You can see who the leaders are in research and development spending. Acquired advantage is a direct result of R&D. Comparative advantage is still a theory, but it goes a long way towards explaining which products a country produces and why. In 1817, 203 years ago, economist David Ricardo created the theory of comparative advantage. He argued that a country boosts its economic growth the most by focusing on the industry in which it had the most substantial comparative advantage. For example, England was able to manufacture cheap cloth. Portugal had the right conditions to make cheap wine. Ricardo predicted that England would stop making wine and Portugal stop making cloth. He was right. England made more money by trading its cloth for Portugal's wine, and vice versa. It would have cost England a lot to make all the wine it needed because it lacked the climate. Portugal didn't have the manufacturing ability to make cheap cloth. Therefore, they both benefited by trading what they produced the most efficiently. This theory of comparative advantage became the rationale for free trade agreements. The theory of comparative advantage explains why trade protectionism doesn't work in the long run. Political leaders are always under pressure from their local constituents to protect jobs from international competition by raising tariffs. But that's only a temporary fix. In the long run, it hurts the nation's competitiveness. It allows the country to waste resources on unsuccessful industries. It also forces consumers to pay higher prices to buy domestic goods. In 1933, two Swedish economists, Heckscher and Olin, propounded a theory that is known as the factor proportions theory. The factor proportions theory explains that different countries are endowed with varying proportions of different factors of production. Some countries have large populations and thus they have a large labor resources. Thus, a country with a large labor force will be able to produce the goods at a lower cost using a labor-intensive mode of operation. Countries with a large supply of capital will specialize in goods that involve a capital-intensive mode of production. The former will export its labor-intensive goods to the latter and import capital-intensive goods from the latter. After the trade, both the countries will have two types of goods at the least cost. Actually, there are four production factors, with land being the one that you don't see. Some countries have lots of land and some don't. Since it's not mobile, it's not listed. However, land would fall under capital like a factory or a facility. Let's talk about human resources. Worldwide, there are 25 countries with declining populations. Right now in the news, you see thousands of immigrants coming out of Syria and Libya, going into Italy, France, and Germany, and the Nordic countries in Sweden and Denmark. The current population of those countries do not like the change in culture that they are experiencing. The problem is the current population is declining, and with a decline, the gross domestic product will decline also. The wealth of the country will go down unless there is an increase in the workforce. Let's talk FDI for Vietnam. As of December 2019, the foreign direct investment was $20 billion with 3,900 new projects approved involving 125 countries. Also, international capital investment in local stocks brought in $15 billion. That's a total of $35 billion coming into Vietnam in the form of investment money. Another source of capital for some countries is money sent home by workers in one country to another country. For example, in 2017, Mexican workers in the United States sent home $26 billion. Many countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, or Qatar have large foreign worker populations from Egypt and Pakistan. Those workers send back even larger amounts to their home countries. Technology as a production factor is becoming more and more important. There are three ways a country can acquire technology. The first is research and development. The second is they can make it part of the deal. If someone builds a factory in your country, they bring in the technology. Number three, some countries steal it. Most people are familiar with the product life cycle, where a new product goes through four stages. The product is introduced to the market. The sales of the new product grow rapidly. After a while, the sales of the product plateau, and then eventually the sales of the product decline. On certain manufactured products, the product life cycle has a side effect on where the product is manufactured. Most new products are developed and manufactured in developed countries. For example, most electronic products from TVs, radios, computers, and cell phones were originally developed and manufactured in the United States. However, as the products grew, it became important to get the costs down. Where could the products be manufactured with low cost? Well, first it was Japan, then it was South Korea and Taiwan, but as their cost rose, it became China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So as the product went through the product life cycle, the location of manufacturing changed. That's why the PLC theory has so much validity. Normally, if you have a theory, you want to test it, so you develop econometric models to do that. The standard trade model takes into account the theories of comparative advantage and the factor proportions model. Remember that the comparative advantage says that a country will produce whatever has the lowest opportunity cost. The factor proportions theory says that countries export products that use the most abundant resources and import products that are scarce to them. Now there are four other variables that they have to take into account. Number one, a country has to have the ability and capacity to produce a product. For example, it's doubtful that Laos could produce seagoing ships because they don't have access to the ocean. Number two, the relative price of a product has to be higher than the cost of producing that product. Another example is the cost of producing a barrel of oil in Saudi Arabia is about $30. In the United States, the cost of producing oil from shale rock is about $90. Because of that high cost, some shale rock companies have been going bankrupt, while other companies have been selling their holdings to the mainstream oil companies like Exxon and British Petroleum, who can afford to take a loss now, but can afford to wait for the price to go on up. Number three, there has to be demand for the product. And number four, a country with a trade surplus in one product may consider accepting a trade deficit in another product so they balance out. There are other variables as well that go into the equation, such as industry efficiency, competitive strategies, and related and supportive industries such as logistics and marketing. One other influence is the country's political stand. The political leaders may or may not want to sell a product to the world market, such as weapons or special commodities. This model is very similar to the diamond of national competitive advantage as described in your textbook. Let me share a very interesting news item that just happened in January. The headline reads, "In India's rift with Malaysia, palm oil and politics don't mix." Malaysia exports most of their palm oil to India. However, Malaysia has just criticized India's policies regarding Muslims. India has retaliated by limiting their palm oil imports. Now, what can we learn from that? Number one, we can learn that politicians don't like criticism and they can retaliate. For example, we know that the Chinese have put millions of Uyghur citizens in concentration camps. What would happen if Vietnam criticized China for doing that? What would happen if Vietnam criticized the U.S. trade policies? What we can learn is that countries don't like other countries to criticize them, especially if they are a major trading partner. Second thing we can learn, can we profit from this situation? Can Vietnam buy the palm oil at a cheap commodity price and resell it or use it for some other product? Can Vietnam fill the gap and sell India some other kind of vegetable oil? If we are nimble on our feet, we might can find a product niche. One last thing about international trade. The World Economic Forum puts out a report every year on how each country is doing with international trade. This report is online, and if you are really interested in what your country's economic strengths and weaknesses are, pull up this report. Better yet, share it with your supervisor. They will be impressed. This chapter gives you a good review of trade theories that influence trade between countries. Next time we start with Chapter 7.